The deep space freighter Odysseus was a dying leviathan. A catastrophic misjump had torn her from the shimmering lanes of plotted space and spat her out, broken and bleeding atmosphere, into the silent, star-choked void of an uncharted system. Her engines were cold slag. Her comms array was a melted ruin, save for one desperate piece of redundancy: the emergency SOS beacon. For 3 cycles, it had pulsed its mournful cry into the emptiness, a single, repeating message of human despair. Captain Eva Restova stood on the bridge, the dim emergency lights etching deep lines of exhaustion into her face. Of her 50 crew, 12 were already dead, suffocated in the initial decompression or killed by the fire that had ravaged the engineering deck. The remaining 38 huddled in the sealed sections, their breath pluming in the rapidly dropping temperature, their hope dwindling with every passing hour. Then, a miracle, or so they thought. Sensors lit up. A distortion in the local space-time, massive and sudden. Then another, and another. A fleet of ships, sleek and predatory, dropped into real space around them. They were like nothing in any human database. Organic curves fused with sharp, metallic edges, resembling the carapaces of some monstrous deep-sea creatures. They did not hail. They did not identify. They simply surrounded the Odysseus and began docking procedures, their airlocks mating with the human ships with a sound like grinding teeth. Hope turned to ice in Ava's veins. This was not a rescue. It was a boarding action. The invaders came through the airlocks in a wave of nightmarish silence. They were tall, bipedal, their forms a horrific fusion of reptile and cephalopod. Scaled hides, the color of deep space void, shimmered over powerful muscle. Their heads were elongated, with vertical, slit-pupiled eyes that glowed with a cold, biological light. Where mouths should have been, a nest of prehensile, needle-tipped tentacles writhed. They carried weapons that looked like grown bone and cartilage, which fired projectiles that didn't kill, but dissolved. They did not communicate. They did not take prisoners. They hunted. The Odysseus became a slaughterhouse. Corridors, once familiar and safe, became a maze of terror. The hunters moved with an uncanny, silent grace, their clawed feet making no sound on the gridded flooring. They were impossibly fast, their tentacles lashing out to snare a fleeing crewman by the ankle, dragging him, screaming, into a side corridor. The screams were always cut short by wet, tearing sounds and the sickening sizzle of acid. Eva, barricaded on the bridge with the remnants of her crew, watched on internal cameras as her people were systematically eradicated. Security Officer Miller made a stand at a choke point, his pulse rifle overheating as he poured fire into an advancing horror. The bolt scorched the creature's hide, but it didn't falter. A tentacle whipped out, wrapping around the barrel of the rifle and melting it to slag. Another tentacle shot forward, the needle tips punching through Miller's helmet visor and into his face. He fell, his features dissolving into a ruin of blood and bone. Blood painted the walls, pooled in the corridors, slick and dark, making the floors treacherous. The air recyclers, already struggling, began to cycle the coppery stench of death throughout the ship. The hunters were methodical, efficient. They were culling the herd. Ava's first officer, a young man named Chen, turned to her, his face ashen. "Captain, they're hurting us. They're driving everyone toward the stern. They're corralling us." That's when she saw it. A pattern in their cold, reptilian eyes. Flicker of discomfort when they passed a vent, blasting cold air from a compromised line. A slight sluggishness in their movements in the colder sections of the ship. Reptiles. Cold-blooded reptiles. A desperate, monstrous plan formed in her mind. It was a gamble with unimaginably high stakes. It would sacrifice the wounded, the trapped, anyone not already on the bridge. It would require her to become a monster to fight monsters. "Chen," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Override all environmental safeties. I want every joule of power from the core, from life support, from everything, rooted to the external thermal regulators." He stared at her, not comprehending. "We're going to make this ship cold," she said. Her eyes fixed on a screen showing 2 of the creatures tearing apart a crewman in the mess hall. Colder than the void outside. "We're going to freeze them where they stand." The order was given. The hum of the ship's systems, the last vestige of its life, died away. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into absolute blackness, save for the glow of emergency battery-powered consoles. Then, a new sound began, a deep, groaning shudder that ran through the entire hull. The external thermal regulators, designed to shed heat from a functioning starship, began to work in reverse. They became massive heat siphons, violently dumping the ship's internal warmth into the freezing vacuum. The temperature plummeted. Frost bloomed across the viewports. The blood on the walls began to crystallize. On the cameras, the hunters stopped. Their movements became jerky, lethargic. The writhing of their facial tentacles slowed to a feeble twitch. Their brilliant eyes dimmed. The deep cold of space, the one environment their biology was utterly unprepared for, was seizing them, locking their joints, freezing their viscous blood solid. They didn't scream, they simply stopped. They became statues of scaled flesh and frozen menace, their weapons still clutched in lifeless claws. Their last predatory gestures frozen for eternity. When the ship's internal temperature matched the void outside, Eva gave the next order. Now, we take their ship. Everyone still alive with me? They moved through a frozen tomb. The corridors were a gallery of horrors, filled with the ice-encrusted bodies of crew and invaders alike. They had to step over frozen pools of blood, past statues of their friends in poses of agony and terror, and past the monstrous forms of their hunters, now as harmless as museum exhibits. They found the main docking, umbilical, forced the frozen hatch, and crossed into the lead alien vessel. The interior was warm, humid, and smelled of musk and ozone. The technology was biological, grown rather than built, but the principles of navigation were universal. Eva Rostova sat in the command chair of the Deathworlder ship, its organic surfaces conforming uncomfortably to a human form. Behind her, the Odysseus hung in the void, a frozen coffin, a memorial to the price of their survival. She input the coordinates for the nearest human outpost. The alien engines, responsive and terrifyingly powerful, thrummed to life. They had come expecting easy prey. They had found instead a species that could weaponize hell itself to survive. They had offered no mercy, and in the end, had received none. As the ship jumped into the shimmering non-space of the warp, the only thought in Ava's mind was that their SOS had not brought rescuers. It had brought a new ship, and humanity had just added a terrifying new vessel to its fledgling fleet.